Have you lost your mind, Dad? Caleb's voice thundered through the lavish office, the walls trembling with the force of his disbelief. He stood there, defiant and polished, his $10,000 suit glinting faintly under the cool daylight that seeped through the panoramic windows. Across the glossy desk sat his father, Richard Harper, the billionaire who had built his empire brick by brick from sheer ruthlessness. Richard's hand hovered over a glass of scotch, his icy blue eyes unflinching as they landed on Caleb. "No, Caleb," Richard said slowly, enunciating every syllable as if speaking to a petulant child. "I've finally come to my senses. For 30 years I've watched you squander every opportunity handed to you. If you can't respect the life you've been given, maybe you'll learn to respect a life devoid of privilege. You think the answer to that is forcing me to deal with a charity case? This is insane." Caleb paced in front of the desk now, his movements frantic. "You want me to date a homeless woman? Well, take her to 5-star restaurants and pretend it's normal?" Richard smirked and leaned back in his chair, amused by his son's meltdown. "That's precisely what I expect you to do." Caleb flushed with anger. "I've tolerated your lectures, fine. I've kept up appearances at the board meetings you dragged me into, even though we both know I don't care about inheriting your empire. But this is how you learn," Richard interrupted sharply, his voice slicing the air like a knife. "Call it a test, a lesson, or a demand. I don't care. You'll do this, or you're done. No inheritance. No trust fund. Nothing." Caleb froze. That one word, "dante," ground him to his core. He knew his father didn't make empty threats. For all his bravado and wealth, Caleb lived in the shadow of Richard Harper, a man who valued control above all else. He couldn't afford to call his bluff, not when every penny Caleb possessed came from his father. "So what? I'm supposed to find some random woman living under a bridge and what? Or convince her to fall in love so you can get your twisted satisfaction?" Caleb spat, though his tone now had traces of resignation. "Oh no," Richard replied almost cheerfully, retrieving a crisp stack of documents from his desk drawer. He slid them toward Caleb. "I've already found someone. Everything you need to know about her is here." Caleb picked up the papers with reluctant hands, his brow furrowing as he read. Ella Carter, age 28, occupation, none. Residence, unhoused, moderate city park. His grip on the papers tightened, his stomach turning. This was too much, even for his father. "You want me to date her?" he whispered, as if the mere question would manifest the absurdity into reality. "That's correct," Richard answered, sipping his scotch. "You'll get to know her, understand her life, show the world a side of yourself that isn't completely self-centered, and, if possible, you'll learn something along the way." Caleb let the papers fall back to the desk. He couldn't ignore the nauseating cocktail of pity and anger twisting in his gut. "And what exactly happens if I refuse?" Richard's smile faded, replaced by the kind of dead-eyed seriousness that Caleb had always known meant trouble. "You know what happens. Walk away if you want, but you'll walk away penniless." His voice dropped into a cold whisper, one that oozed finality. "I'm done coddling you, son." Silence fell between them, heavy and oppressive. Caleb stared at his father, hoping, futilely, that the man would crack a smile and call it all a sick joke. But Richard's face remained stony. There was no escape. After what felt like an eternity, Caleb inhaled sharply, forcing himself to meet his father's gaze. "Fine," he muttered. Richard studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. Tonight you'll start?" The sun was sinking low over the city as Caleb gripped the steering wheel of his black Aston Martin, his knuckles white against the fine leather. He cursed under his breath, glancing at the crumpled paper in the passenger seat. The address pointed him toward a park near the city's edge, a place he'd never visited and never thought he'd have to. "Moderate city park," Caleb muttered bitterly. "What am I supposed to do? Approach her like she's on a dating app?" He parked the car at a secluded corner of the park and stepped out, pushing his hands into the pockets of his coat. The air was cooler than usual, a slight breeze rustling the leaves, and the faint scent of burnt charcoal wafted from a nearby drum fire. Clusters of people huddled close to the fire or rested on the grass beneath thin patches of fabric strung up as makeshift tents. Caleb's carefully polished shoes crunched against the gravel path as his gaze swept over the scene. And then he saw her. Ella Carter sat with a worn backpack pulled into her lap, her frame disappearing beneath an oversized hoodie. Her hair, dark and slightly tousled, fell to her shoulders in uneven waves. Her eyes, though surrounded by dark circles, were sharp and alert, darting between the faces around her. For a moment, Caleb just stood there, suspended in the strange discomfort of what he was about to do. He felt the weight of his father's demand like an iron chain around his neck. Every instinct told him to walk away, but he clenched his jaw, shoved his hesitation aside, and took a step forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice louder than intended. Several heads turned, and he felt a wave of heat rise to his cheeks. Ella looked up, her brow knitted in confusion. "Yeah? Can I help you?" Caleb hesitated, suddenly acutely aware of how ridiculous this was. Approaching strangers in a park wasn't exactly in his wheelhouse, let alone this. But he forced a smile. "Hi, my name is Caleb Harper. I was wondering if you had a moment." Ella stared at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You some kind of journalist?" she asked. There was a trace of suspicion in her tone, but not unwarranted. She had the look of someone who had been burned one too many times by people who acted like they cared. "No," Caleb replied quickly, though the word came out a little too defensive. "No, not that. I just wanted to talk." Ella tilted her head slightly, her skepticism unrelenting. "Talk about what?" Caleb opened his mouth to answer, but the words tangled on his tongue. What was he supposed to say? He couldn't just blurt out, "My billionaire father is making me date you," as a morality lesson. "Look," she said, standing up and shrugging her backpack onto her shoulder, "I don't know what you want, but I don't have time for it." "Wait," Caleb blurted, panicking slightly. He wasn't sure if it was the desperation in his voice or her own curiosity, but Ella paused, turning back to him with one eyebrow arched. "You don't even know why I'm here," he said, exhaling sharply. "Just give me 5 minutes. That's all I ask." Ella studied him hard, her gaze lingering on his shoes, polished, expensive, and completely out of place here. "5 minutes," she said finally. "But if this turns into some kind of lecture about life choices, I'm walking away." "Deal," Caleb replied, forcing another tight-lipped smile. Ella crossed her arms over her chest, keeping her chin slightly raised as Caleb stumbled over what to say next. Beneath her wary smirk, like she had seen 100 people like him already in her life, there was a sharpness in her eyes that unnerved him. She wasn't just sizing him up, she was reading him, dissecting every gesture, every subtle shift in his tone, like she was waiting for the moment he tripped up and revealed some ulterior motive. It felt uncomfortable. "So," she asked, breaking the silence, "you've got 5 minutes. Use them." Caleb, unused to being rushed or cornered like this, straightened his posture and cleared his throat. "Right?" he muttered, glancing around the park first and then back to Ella. "The truth is His voice trailed off. He couldn't actually tell her the real truth. There was no way that would fly. Instead, he stumbled onto the only halfway coherent story he could think of. "I work with a charity foundation," he lied, regretting it instantly but committing to the act anyway. "We're running a new project aimed at understanding and addressing homelessness, and part of that involves connecting with people directly. You know, learning from them." Ella arched an eyebrow. Her arms were still crossed, but she shifted her weight to her other foot. "You work for a foundation?" she repeated skeptically, tilting her head in disbelief. "And you're telling me you're starting by just showing up here? With no plan, no staff, no clipboard? You're just taking a stroll through the slums and thought you'd chat up a few poor souls?" Caleb swallowed hard. Her sarcasm felt like a knife, hot and cutting, and he had no clue how to respond without making it worse. "Well, yes," he stammered. "We believe in a hands-on approach." "Hands-on," she shot back. "I notice your hands are still in your coat pockets." He winced. For the second time in just minutes, Caleb felt the ground shift under him. This wasn't going well. Not at all. But there was something about the way she kept looking at him that made him want to keep trying, even if every failure only cemented her opinion of him as an insufferable rich guy. Before Caleb could stammer some excuse, Ella shook her head and started walking away. "Wait," Caleb called after her, his voice more desperate than he'd intended. He took a step forward, practically jogging to match her pace. Their surroundings blurred into nothingness as he focused only on her retreating figure. "Look, I'm sorry if I came off wrong," he said breathlessly as she finally slowed her pace, glancing sideways at him. "I'm not trying to offend you, okay? Promise." "You think you're the first person to promise me that?" Ella shot back, her tone cool and detached, though her steps had stopped entirely now. "Let me guess. You took one look at me, sitting on that bench with my busted old backpack, and thought you'd be inspiring. Thought if you just dropped some pocket change, or worse, threw me some invisible opportunity, you could walk away feeling like you did your good deed for the decade." Her words landed like hammers, and Caleb instinctively raised his hands in defense. It's not like that," he said, though he realized he'd done a poor job of convincing her otherwise. "You've got the wrong idea about me." "Oh, do I?" she said flatly. "Please, feel free to prove me wrong. Explain to me why you're really here, dressed like the kids these politicians sell their votes to, standing in the middle of a park where people are just trying to exist." Her voice cracked halfway through, and Caleb realized, somewhere buried beneath her sarcasm and disdain, there was a raw wound still fresh, years of being overlooked or judged or moved aside like a nuisance. Her tone wasn't just accusatory, there was genuine exhaustion in it too. And it bothered him. This wasn't pity, Caleb realized. It was something else entirely. "Okay," Caleb said finally, dropping the polished facade he hadn't realized he'd been clinging to. "You want me to be honest? Here it is, I don't know what I'm doing." Ella glanced sideways then, her expression softening by a fraction. "I'm serious," Caleb continued. "I was sent here by someone who wants me to learn something. Someone who thinks people like me," he paused, struggling for words, "don't understand what it's like to actually live." He watched her eyebrows knit in confusion at his phrasing, but for once, she didn't interrupt him. "That's why I'm here. I'm not trying to fix you or insult you or whatever you think I'm doing. I'm just supposed to listen and learn." For a long moment, Ella didn't say anything. She shifted the weight of her pack on her shoulders and looked down toward the grass at her feet. The hesitant silence felt almost worse than her sharpest retort, but maybe that meant something had landed. "So you're not here to write some article?" she asked cautiously. "Or parade me around for pity points?" "No," Caleb said, more firmly now. "I'm here because I don't really have a choice." Ella's eyes flicked back up toward him. The skepticism was still there, but as he stared back at her, he saw her expression unravel piece by piece, giving way to something softer, even if just slightly. Not like trust, but maybe curiosity. "Well, you're right about one thing," she said with a faint smirk. "You clearly don't know what you're doing." Caleb exhaled a small, almost relieved laugh. He stuffed his hands into his coat pockets and glanced away, allowing himself a second to breathe. Ella crossed her arms again, tilting her head as though still gauging him. "So now what? You've gotten me to pity you for being clueless. What's the next part of your master plan?" Caleb threw his hands up in mock surrender. "Honestly, I was hoping you could tell me." She blinked, then barked out a short laugh, clearly caught off guard by the unexpected quip. Her stance relaxed just a hair, her guard coming down, but only slightly. "You must really be out of your depth," she said. "First time talking to someone with no PR team, huh? Is it that obvious?" Caleb shot back, a crooked grin tugging at his lips. Ella sighed, shaking her head as if defeating herself with her own decision. "Fine, you've got me curious. But don't think I'm about to roll over and spill my life story just because you look like you're in over your head." "I wouldn't expect anything else," Caleb replied. "So how does this work? We just talk?" Ella snorted. "How about this? You ask me whatever you want, and I'll decide for myself if it's worth answering." She pointed a finger at him sharply. "But fair warning, if you ask some tired, surface-level question like, 'How do you end up here?' I'm out. Got it?" Caleb blinked. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or feel insulted. "Got it," he said anyway. They didn't shake hands or make any formal agreement. Instead, Ella motioned for him to follow her, and as she turned, Caleb noticed for the first time just how awkwardly her oversized hoodie hung against her, the outline of her slim figure almost swallowed by the fabric. It seemed, strangely, that in dragging himself deep into discomfort, Caleb was beginning to see her, not faceless, not objectified, but a person, something his preconceptions hadn't allowed before. He followed her silently, unsure of whether to call this progress or insanity. They walked side by side without speaking at first, an invisible gulf of tension lingering between them. The gravel path crunched beneath their feet as they moved deeper into the park, away from the larger groups of people around the fire drums. For the first time in his life, Caleb was acutely aware of how out of place he was. The sharp lines of his tailored coat, the unmistakable gloss of his leather shoes, they all felt embarrassingly loud against the muted, weather-beaten surroundings. People glanced at him and then turned away, seemingly unimpressed but nonetheless noting the contrast. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets and followed Ella without another word, resigned to letting her take the lead. Ella, by contrast, didn't seem to care what anyone around them thought. She walked casually, her slight frame swaying as she adjusted the straps of her worn backpack. Her gaze darted here and there, scanning the area in a way that suggested vigilance, not curiosity. She didn't trust this world, or him. So, she said, finally breaking the silence and looking at him sideways. "You've been staring at my backpack for a while now. What's the deal? Trying to guess what's in it?" Caleb blinked, startled by the sudden question. "No, I wasn't. I didn't mean to." Ella laughed, a short, dry sound. "Relax, rich boy. You're obvious, that's all. You're probably wondering what someone like me carries around all day." That wasn't entirely true, or maybe it was subconsciously. Now that she'd said it, though, Caleb realized he was curious. He glanced at the fraying straps of the backpack again. It looked heavy, like it had seen better days. "What's in it?" he asked hesitantly before adding, "If you don't mind me asking." Ella mused, as if deliberating whether her answer would amuse, educate, or embarrass him. "The essentials. Couple changes of clothes, a bottle of water, deodorant, a book." "A book?" Caleb interrupted, his brows raising in surprise. That wasn't what he'd expected. "Yes, a book," Ella replied pointedly, giving him a withering look. "What, do you think being broke automatically makes me illiterate?" Caleb flinched. "No, I didn't mean it like that. I just wasn't expecting that, is all." "What kind of book?" Ella smirked, her pace slowing. "Wouldn't you like to know?" He opened his mouth to argue, then shut it again when her smirk widened. This was a game, he realized, one Ella had spent years perfecting. She wasn't giving anything away easily, not even something as simple as the title of a book. In a strange way, it fascinated him. Back in his world, people came prepackaged with their bios plastered across their social media profiles. They wanted to be known, wanted to be seen. Ella? She played her cards so close, it was infuriating. And yet, it worked. He wanted to know more. "You're impossible, you know that?" Caleb muttered. Ella shrugged. "Takes one to know one, doesn't it?" They walked on in silence for another few moments before Ella stopped abruptly, turning to a stone bench under a flickering lamppost. She motioned for Caleb to sit, then perched herself on the opposite edge of the bench, still keeping her distance. "All right, since I'm feeling generous, I'll let you ask me another question," she said, leaning back slightly and crossing her arms. "But remember, rich boy, no cliches. If you ask me something stupid, I'm gone." Caleb rubbed the back of his neck, feeling oddly nervous. He wasn't used to being tested like this, or, frankly, being the one holding a conversation that didn't revolve around him. "Okay," he said slowly, trying to think of something that wouldn't make her immediately shut him down. "What's something you wish people understood about you?" Ella's expression flickered, surprise, maybe, or approval, though it was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual guarded smirk. "Not bad," she said. "Most people go straight for pity questions like, 'What's the hardest thing about your life?' Or some crap like that." "And?" Caleb prompted. "What's your answer?" She hesitated, looking past him at the dim glow of the distant park lights. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, her face softening in a way that made her look younger, almost vulnerable. "I guess," she began slowly, then stopped and shook her head. "No, forget it." "No, come on," Caleb pressed. "You can't just start and then back out." "What is it?" Ella sighed, glaring at him as if his persistence was some great inconvenience. "Still," she answered. "I wish people understood that I didn't choose this," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but beneath it, there was tension, like a string pulled too tight. People see someone on the street and think they must have done something to deserve it, like it's a punishment for bad choices. But it isn't. Sometimes life just falls apart. And one bad day turns into another, and suddenly it's not just a bad day anymore. It's your life. Her words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Caleb didn't know how to respond. He wanted to say something supportive, something kind, but every phrase that came to mind felt hollow or patronizing. For the first time in his life, he found himself at a total loss for the right thing to say. Ella, noticing his silence, leaned back against the bench and crossed her arms again, her smirk returning. "What's the matter, rich boy? Cat got your tongue?" "Just thinking," Caleb murmured. She gave him a skeptical look but didn't press further. Instead, she shifted the subject. "All right, my turn." "Your turn?" Caleb asked, puzzled. "To ask a question," Ella clarified, tilting her head mockingly. "That's how this works. Unless you're afraid I'll ask something you don't want to answer?" Caleb hesitated, then nodded. "All right, go ahead." Ella leaned forward slightly, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "What does someone like you, someone who's never had to worry about where their next meal is coming from, do when they're alone? What do you think about?" His brow furrowed at the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Ella said, gesturing toward him, "what happens when you're not, I don't know, racing cars or throwing cash at parties or whatever people like you do? What's in your head when all of that noise dies down?" The question caught him off guard, not because it was particularly intrusive, but because no one had ever thought to ask him that before. It was always about his outward life, how he spent his money, who he was seen with, what he was wearing. People never asked about the silence. "I don't know," he admitted after a moment. I guess I think about what I'm supposed to be." Ella raised an eyebrow. "Supposed to be?" "Yeah," Caleb said, glancing down at his hands. "My dad has all these expectations for me, what I should accomplish, who I should be. I've spent my whole life trying to live up to them. But the truth is," he trailed off, unsure of whether to finish the thought. Ella tilted her head. "The truth is what?" Caleb hesitated, then sighed. "The truth is, I don't even know what I want to be. I've never figured that out. Everything's been decided for me. And sometimes it just feels like none of it matters." To his surprise, Ella didn't scoff or ridicule him for his confession. Instead, she leaned back again, her gaze thoughtful. "Huh," she said softly. "Guess you're not just a pretty face after all." Caleb blinked, then laughed despite himself. "That's the nicest thing you've said to me all night." "Don't get used to it," Ella replied with a smirk. "I still think you're a spoiled brat." "Fair," Caleb admitted, smiling faintly. For the first time, the silence that followed didn't feel so uncomfortable. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. The night deepened around them, the park growing quieter as the distant sounds of the city faded into a soft hum. Caleb and Ella sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The lamppost flickered above them, casting a warm, uneven glow that made the shadows dance across their faces. Ella shifted slightly, her gaze drifting to the sky where a few stars had begun to peek through the urban haze. "You ever look at the stars and wonder what it's all about?" she asked suddenly, her voice softer than before. Caleb glanced up, following her gaze. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I usually get distracted before I can think too deeply about it." "Figures," Ella said with a small smile. "People like you have the luxury of distraction." Caleb didn't take offense. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I guess we do." Ella sighed and leaned back, her eyes still fixed on the sky. "When I was a kid, I used to think the stars were holes in the sky, little peaks into heaven. My mom told me that." Caleb turned to look at her, intrigued by this glimpse into her past. Your mom sounds like she had a way with words. She did, Ella replied, a hint of sadness in her voice. She was everything. Strong and smart. She could make you believe in anything. What happened to her? Caleb asked gently, sensing this was a delicate topic. Ella was silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. She died, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Cancer. I was 16. I'm sorry, Caleb said, feeling the inadequacy of his words. Ella shrugged, but her eyes were distant, lost in memories. It was a long time ago, but it changed everything. Without her, everything fell apart. Caleb wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but he didn't know how. Instead, he just sat there listening, hoping that was enough. After she died, my dad couldn't handle it, Ella continued, her voice steadier now. He started drinking, lost his job. We lost the house. I tried to keep things together, but you know how it goes. One bad day turns into another. Caleb nodded, understanding more than he'd expected to. And you ended up here? Yeah, Ella said with a bitter laugh. Funny how life works, huh? They fell into silence again, but it was different this time. There was a shared understanding, a fragile connection that hadn't been there before. Caleb cleared his throat, wanting to shift the mood. So, what's the book you're carrying around? Ella glanced at him, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn paperback. She handed it to him without a word. Caleb took the book, examining the cover. The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, he read aloud. I've heard of this. It's about following your dreams, right? Ella nodded. Yeah. It's one of the few things I've held on to. It reminds me that even when things are tough, there's still hope. There's still a journey worth taking. Caleb handed the book back to her, feeling a strange mix of admiration and envy. You're stronger than I am, he said quietly. Ella looked at him, surprised. What makes you say that? You've been through so much and you're still here, Caleb replied. You're still fighting. I don't know if I could do that. Ella smiled, a real smile this time. You'd be surprised what you're capable of when you have no other choice. Caleb nodded, taking her words to heart. Maybe you're right. They sat there for a while longer, talking about everything and nothing. Caleb found himself opening up in ways he never had before, sharing his fears, his doubts, his insecurities. And Ella listened, really listened, without judgment or pity. As the night grew colder, Ella finally stood up, stretching her arms. I should get going, she said. It's late. Caleb stood up too, feeling a strange reluctance to part ways. Can I see you again? He asked, surprising himself with the question. Ella looked at him, her expression unreadable. Why? I don't know, Caleb admitted. I feel like I have a lot to learn from you. Ella studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, same time tomorrow? Caleb smiled, relieved. Yeah, same time tomorrow. As Ella walked away, Caleb watched her, feeling a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, this strange journey his father had sent him on would lead to something more than he'd ever expected. The next day, Caleb found himself eagerly anticipating his meeting with Ella. He spent the morning going through the motions of his usual routine, but his mind kept drifting back to their conversation in the park. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of something important, something that could change him in ways he didn't fully understand yet. By the time evening rolled around, he was already at the park, waiting on the same bench where they'd sat the night before. He checked his watch, then glanced around, hoping to see Ella's familiar figure approaching. When she finally arrived, she looked the same as she had the previous night, worn backpack, oversized hoodie, guarded expression. But there was a slight softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a hint of trust. Hey, Caleb said, standing up as she approached. Hey, Ella replied, sitting down on the bench. You're early. Yeah, Caleb admitted, sitting down next to her. I guess I was looking forward to this. Ella raised an eyebrow. Really? Why? Caleb shrugged, unsure how to explain. I don't know. I feel like I can be myself around you. Like I don't have to pretend. Ella studied him for a moment, then nodded. That's good. Pretending is exhausting. They fell into an easy conversation, talking about their lives, their dreams, their fears. Caleb found himself opening up even more, sharing things he'd never told anyone. And Ella, in turn, shared more of her own story, revealing the layers of pain and resilience that had shaped her. As the evening wore on, Caleb realized that he was beginning to see Ella not just as a homeless woman, but as a person, strong, intelligent, and deeply human. He admired her strength, her ability to find hope in the darkest of circumstances. And he began to see his own life in a new light, recognizing the privilege he'd taken for granted. At one point, Ella turned to him, her expression serious. "Caleb, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Caleb replied, curious. "Why are you really doing this?" Ella asked. "Why are you spending time with me? What's in it for you?" Caleb hesitated, knowing this was the moment of truth. He could lie, continue the facade he'd built, or he could be honest. "I told you before, my father sent me here," Caleb said slowly. "He thinks I need to learn something, to understand what life is really about. At first, I thought it was just some twisted punishment. But now, I think he might be right." Ella looked at him, her eyes searching his. "And what have you learned so far?" Caleb took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words. "I've learned that I've been living in a bubble, taking everything for granted. I've learned that there's so much more to people than what you see on the surface. And I've learned that I have a lot to learn." Ella smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. "That's a good start." They sat there in silence for a while, watching the stars come out one by one. Caleb felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of connection that went beyond words. As the night grew colder, Ella stood up, stretching her arms. "I should get going," she said. "It's late." Caleb stood up too, feeling a strange reluctance to part ways. Can I see you again?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Ella looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Why? I don't know," Caleb admitted. I feel like I have a lot to learn from you." Ella studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, same time tomorrow?" Caleb smiled, relieved. "Yeah, same time tomorrow." As Ella walked away, Caleb watched her, feeling a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, this strange journey his father had sent him on would lead to something more than he'd ever expected. The next evening, Caleb arrived at the park earlier than usual, his mind racing with thoughts of the previous night's conversation. He had spent the day reflecting on everything Ella had shared, her strength and resilience leaving a profound impact on him. He realized that he was beginning to see the world through a different lens, one that wasn't clouded by privilege and entitlement. As he waited on the bench, he noticed Ella approaching from a distance. She looked slightly different tonight, still wearing her oversized hoodie and carrying her worn backpack, but there was a subtle confidence in her stride, a determination in her eyes. "Hey," Caleb greeted her with a smile as she sat down next to him. "Hey," Ella replied, her expression softening. "You're early again." "Yeah, I guess I couldn't wait to see you," Caleb admitted, feeling a bit embarrassed by his eagerness. Ella raised an eyebrow, a playful smirk tugging at her lips. "Careful, rich boy. You're starting to sound like you actually care." Caleb chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe I do." They fell into an easy conversation, picking up where they had left off the night before. Caleb found himself sharing more about his life, his struggles with living up to his father's expectations, and his own insecurities. Ella listened intently, offering insights and advice that surprised him with their wisdom. As the evening wore on, Caleb decided to take a risk. He wanted to know more about Ella's past, to understand the events that had led her to this point. "Ella, can I ask you something personal?" he asked cautiously. Ella glanced at him, her expression guarded. "Depends on what it is." "I want to know more about your past," Caleb said gently. "You mentioned your mom and how things fell apart after she passed. But what about before that? What was your life like?" Ella hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. For a moment, Caleb thought she might refuse to answer, but then she took a deep breath and began to speak. "I had a pretty normal childhood, I guess," she said slowly. "We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. My mom worked as a nurse, and my dad was a mechanic. They were good people, hardworking and loving. We had a small house, a garden, and a dog named Max. She paused, a wistful smile crossing her face as she remembered. I was a good student too. Straight A's, lots of friends. I even had dreams of becoming a doctor, like my mom. But then everything changed. Caleb listened intently, his heart aching for the girl she had been. What happened? My mom got sick, Ella continued, her voice growing softer. Cancer. It was aggressive, and by the time they caught it, it was too late. She fought hard, but she didn't make it. After she died, my dad fell apart. He started drinking, lost his job, and we couldn't keep up with the bills. We lost the house, and eventually, we ended up on the streets. She looked up at Caleb, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and defiance. I tried to keep things together, to take care of my dad, but it was too much. He passed away a few years later, and I've been on my own ever since. Caleb was silent, absorbing the weight of her story. He felt a deep sense of admiration for her strength, but also a profound sadness for everything she had endured. Ella, I'm so sorry, he said softly. I can't even imagine what you've been through. Ella shrugged, her expression hardening. It is what it is. Life doesn't always go the way you plan. Caleb nodded, understanding that her resilience was born out of necessity. You're incredibly strong, you know that? Ella smiled faintly, a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. I've had to be. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Caleb felt a growing sense of respect and admiration for Ella, but also a desire to help her in any way he could. Ella, I want to help you, he said suddenly, surprising even himself with the intensity of his words. Ella looked at him, her expression skeptical. Help me? How? I don't know yet, Caleb admitted. But I want to try. You've been through so much, and you deserve a chance to rebuild your life. Maybe I can use my resources to make that happen. Ella shook her head, her eyes narrowing. I don't need your charity, Caleb. I've survived this long on my own. It's not charity, Caleb insisted. It's friendship. I care about you, Ella, and I want to see you succeed. Ella studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. You really mean that, don't you? Yes, Caleb said firmly. I do. Ella sighed, her shoulders relaxing. All right, rich boy. I'll give you a chance. But don't think this is going to be easy. I'm not some damsel in distress waiting to be saved. I wouldn't expect anything less, Caleb replied with a grin. Over the next few weeks, Caleb and Ella continued to meet in the park, their conversations growing deeper and more meaningful with each passing day. Caleb found himself looking forward to their meetings, eager to learn more about Ella and to share his own thoughts and feelings. One evening, as they sat on their usual bench, Caleb decided to take a bold step. Ella, I've been thinking, he began, his voice hesitant. What if you came to stay with me for a while? Ella looked at him, her eyes widening in surprise. Stay with you? In your fancy penthouse? Yeah, Caleb said, his heart pounding. I know it's a big ask, but I think it could be good for both of us. You'd have a safe place to stay, and I could learn more about what it's like to live without all the privileges I've taken for granted. Ella frowned, her expression conflicted. I don't know, Caleb. That's a lot to ask. I'm not sure I'd be comfortable living in your world. I understand, Caleb said quickly. But think about it. You'd have a roof over your head, a bed to sleep in, and we could figure out a plan to help you get back on your feet. It wouldn't be permanent, just until you're ready to move on. Ella was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the ground. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. All right, she said softly. I'll give it a try. But if it doesn't work out, I'm gone. No hard feelings. Deal, Caleb said, relief washing over him. Thank you, Ella. I promise I'll do everything I can to make this work. The next day, Caleb picked Ella up from the park and drove her to his penthouse. As they entered the building, Ella looked around in awe, her eyes wide with wonder. The lobby was filled with marble and glass, the air scented with fresh flowers. It was a far cry from the park where she had been living. Caleb led her to the elevator, and they rode up to the top floor in silence. When the doors opened, Ella stepped out into the spacious penthouse, her jaw dropping at the sight. The living room was filled with sleek, modern furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Wow, Ella whispered, her voice filled with awe. This is incredible. Caleb smiled, feeling a mix of pride and humility. Welcome to my home, he said. Make yourself comfortable. Ella wandered around the penthouse, taking in the luxurious surroundings. She paused in front of a large painting on the wall, her eyes tracing the intricate details. This place is amazing, Caleb. I can't believe you live here. Caleb shrugged, feeling a bit self-conscious. It's just a place. What matters is that you're here now. Ella turned to look at him, her expression softening. Thank you, Caleb. I appreciate this. I really do. Over the next few days, Caleb and Ella settled into a new routine. They spent their days exploring the city, visiting museums, parks, and other attractions. Caleb introduced Ella to his friends, who were initially shocked by her presence but quickly warmed to her charm and wit. In the evenings, they would return to the penthouse and talk late into the night, sharing their hopes, dreams, and fears. Caleb found himself growing more and more attached to Ella, her strength and resilience inspiring him in ways he hadn't expected. One night, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Caleb turned to Ella, his heart pounding. Ella, I need to tell you something, he said, his voice trembling. Ella looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. What is it, Caleb? I think I'm falling in love with you, Caleb confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Ella's eyes widened in surprise, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find the right words. Caleb, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Caleb said quickly. I just needed you to know. You've changed my life, Ella. You've made me see the world in a whole new way. And I can't imagine my life without you in it. Ella was silent for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears. Caleb, I care about you too. More than I ever thought possible. But I'm scared. I've been hurt so many times before, and I don't know if I can handle it again. Caleb reached out and took her hand, his grip gentle but firm. I understand, Ella. And I promise I'll do everything I can to protect you, to make you feel safe. I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. Ella looked into his eyes, her tears spilling over. I love you too, Caleb, she whispered. But we have a lot to figure out. This isn't going to be easy. I know, Caleb said, his heart swelling with hope. But we'll face it together, one step at a time. The next few evenings followed a similar pattern. Caleb and Ella would meet at the park, sit on the same bench, and talk for hours about everything and nothing. Caleb found himself looking forward to these meetings more than anything else in his life. They became a refuge, a place where he could be himself without the weight of his father's expectations or the superficiality of his social circle. One night, as they sat under the flickering lamppost, Ella seemed more pensive than usual. She stared up at the sky, her eyes distant. Something on your mind? Caleb asked gently. Ella sighed, her breath visible in the cool night air. I've been thinking about my mom a lot lately, she admitted. It's been 10 years since she died, and it still feels like yesterday.